Hello everyone, my name is tobyhorrorboy, and today we're going to be customizing a Hatchimals Penguala into Little Buddy from Splatoon 3. This was a commission for my friend Ren as a gift to their friend. So thank you Ren for commissioning me, because I probably wouldn't have made something like this otherwise, and he's such a cute little guy. As always, the first thing we have to do with any animatronic is skin him. I have a video of that up on my channel if you're interested, and a whole playlist of skinning videos, which sounds just awful out of context. But once he's skinned, this is what we're left with. He waddles and can even turn himself around, flaps his wings, and his eyes light up depending on his mood. Our Penguala has a touch sensor on his head, a button on his chest, and his beak is also a button that you can push in, likely to feed him. He knows when you flip him upside down too, so I guess he has some kind of gyro sensor as well. We might have skinned him, but there's still more to get rid of before we start adding on to him. By which I mean that his wings are in the way and we need them gone so we can have flippers later. We protect his delicate electronics by taping up his eye holes so no plastic dust gets in there. I tried the rotary tool to cut through them, but they're kind of squishy and cutting them wasn't really doing it. Sometimes the answer is pliers and brute force. Generally speaking, we want to keep as much functionality as possible on each animatronic that we customize. I know that we're going to lose the head sensor, so we need to keep the chest and mouth buttons intact and working. To work around the beak being its own button, we're going to cut it back and make what's left into his tongue. His upper and lower beak are going to be built around that, and his mouth is going to be open. We started cutting the beak down, and I just couldn't get through it no matter what I tried. And you know it's serious when I pull out the hacksaw. It turns out that there's metal in there, and we're gonna get around it by sanding the plastic back with our rotary tool. We'll be reshaping it later, but for now we know that it's structurally sound and that it'll function as a tongue button. This whole little guy needs to be sanded because he's gonna be totally covered in foam and foam clay. But for now, we're gonna sand his flipper pieces and everything below them that's gonna be covered by that sock thing he wears. The Penguala is so similar in shape to Little Buddy, but his lower half is much too skinny. We're gonna pad him out using EVA foam. These are the edge pieces of the EVA foam mats that most people probably throw away. But by slicing off the jigsaw edges, I find that they work really well for this sort of thing. We glue them on with contact cement, starting at the bottom and working our way up. Contact cement is my favorite adhesive and possibly my best friend because it's just that good. You put a thin coat on the two pieces you want to glue, wait for it to become mostly touch dry, and then stick them together. If you've done it right, whatever you've glued will be attached forever. I've torn foam and fabric before the glue is budged, so you really have to get that placement right on your first try. This isn't sponsored, I just have strong feelings about this glue. His chest button will get a cover made from a separate piece of foam so we can still press it in, but for now we're gonna start rounding out his body. I used the bone scissors to take off some of the foam that we're definitely getting rid of, but the majority of this is done with the sanding head on the rotary tool. Little Buddy has a very particular shape to him, and we want the silhouette to match to the best of our ability. Or I guess just the best of my ability, because I'm the only one here. I get the occasional comment asking if this is a multi-person channel, but I, tobyhorrorboy, am just one guy. Sometimes one of my friends will help me with something, and my wonderful partner Albedo has started making thumbnails for me, and I always credit them and say thank you in the video, so you'll know if it's not just me hanging out and making stuff. Gradually filling the house with toy animatronics. But the real reason I tend to say we instead of I is that I'm including you. If you're watching my videos, then that means that you're involved and implicated in whatever thing we make. Can you please turn the air purifier up? The room smells like hot foam sandings and industrial strength glue. Also, you have fantastic taste in PlayStation 2 games. Good on you. Sorry, I love the sound of my own voice, probably a consequence of spending so much time alone in my craft room. Okay, but you can see that I took a bit too much off in a few areas. This animatronic sits a bit skew-whiff because of the wheels under him, so I was having some difficulty telling if he was symmetrical. We can patch those areas by gluing on craft foam. Having the edges be rounded makes it much easier to blend these pieces into the rest of the body, and we can sand them until we're happy with the shape. We also need to bulk up the back of his neck with EVA foam. Then we can trim it and sand it down. The entire upper part of his body and his tail is going to be covered in foam clay, so this is just to get the basic shapes in place. Now we move on to his pointy little fish butt. Chicken butt, chicken fish butt, salmonid butt, whatever. He's a strange little fella. We cut out some ovals that taper down in size and glue them onto his body. His tail points upwards, so we glue them on going up. Now we sand it to blend our layers together. I find it really helpful to draw on guidelines for where I need to sand with Sharpie. You'll notice those a lot in my projects. I've patterned his actual tail flipper piece, and we cut that out of our high-density EVA foam. Not the floor mats, the good stuff we use when it'll be visible, kind of like bringing out the nice plates when you've got guests over. Now we cut into the end of the tail and mark out exactly where the fin will sit. Then we can glue it in with contact cement. We'll leave that for now and jump over to the eyes. Small Fry has these absolutely enormous eyes. They are disproportionately large. We're gonna make the eyes themselves out of ping pong balls, Muppet style. To get them to sit right on his head, we need to sand down his eye holes. Of course, that's right where the circuit board is, so I shoved some duct tape in there to protect it. Maybe something cool and interesting will happen if I sand off parts of the circuit board, but today isn't the day we find out. We make the eye sockets much larger, mostly going up and out towards the sides of the head. While we're here, we're gonna sand down a significant portion of his beak. It's almost time to use our foam clay, and it's much more efficient to have multiple spots drying at once. You're meant to wait 48 hours for it to dry before touching it, and I always do multiple coats and patch-ups to get it as smooth as possible. We also sand the edges of his tail fin to taper them. Finally, we can cut out a cover for his chest button and sand down the edges. Then we glue it in and sand it to match the rest of his body. That button is very functional, and you won't be able to see that it's a separate piece once he's wearing his clothes. And it's foam clay time. I use foam clay a lot. I really like working with it, and I find it super easy to use. You sculpt it like clay, and then it air dries and becomes foam. And we know how much I love to work with foam. It also sticks to just about anything, and you can add a tiny drop of water to make it easier to work with. Basically, the plan for Little Buddy is to make and detail his tail and tongue with foam clay. When those are completely sculpted and done bar painting, we're gonna make his mouth base and then cover his entire upper body in foam clay. We won't have to worry about the plastic looking different from, say, his flippers or tail, because it'll all be foam. We coat a thin layer of foam clay onto his tail flipper and use a sculpting tool to create the lines on each side. I wanted these to be visibly three-dimensional because I didn't want it to look like I'd just painted them on. We also cover the tail itself in foam clay so the cheaper foam core isn't visible. And we can fill out any gaps that are going to be hidden by his clothes so they sit nicely on him later. Once it's dry, we sand it down with the rotary tool very carefully and on a slow setting. Then we go back in with more foam clay in any areas that could use a touch-up, adding a drop of water here and there to smooth it out. I repeated the sculpting and sanding process a few times, so I have a huge amount of footage of that. While I show you a curated selection, allow me to tell you my tale. I haven't played Splatoon 3. I played the first Splatoon game and really enjoyed it, but I never got the sequels. I used to work at a store that got secondhand video games in, and I don't know if you guys know this about me, but I've got a bit of a game collection. Because we'd get them in secondhand at work, and they were usually really cheap. Most of the games we had would be $4, unless they were newer releases or AAA Nintendo titles. Zelda, Mario, Pokemon, and Splatoon were always going to be more than $4, always. So I never bought them. Maybe Splatoon 2 would be $40, but that's like 10 other games. Not when I could get Beastly for the Nintendo Wii for a measly $4, you can't even get a coffee for that. And maybe any Pokemon game is worth 10 different Assassin's Creed games or whatever, but in my mind, a video game is $4. I left that job years ago, but I still have that in my head, so I rarely buy video games. So I have over 500 games, and none of them are Splatoon 3. I've got 3 different copies of Bully Scholarship Edition though, and I think that makes up for it, maybe. Welcome to my twisted mind. I would love to play Splatoon 3, but I don't have it, so I can't play it, so I guess I'll just play Bully for the 8th time. It looks great, and I'm sure it's a lot of fun, and one day that'll be for me. I've now rambled for so long that his tongue and tail fin are done. But because of the 48-hour drying time between coats, that took ages. So as to not waste any time, I was absolutely making his flippers and the base for his mouth while waiting for the clay to dry. Let's run through that now. It's a very similar process. We pattern the flippers, upper mouth and lower mouth, and cut them out of 1mm craft foam. We want the flipper base to be pretty thin so we can build it up without it being too bulky. To start building them up, we coat them in a layer of foam clay, trying to get it mostly smooth. Then we use, and this detail is important, the pom-pom Purin pen to draw out where the flipper lines will go. Looking at his model, you can see that there's a clear front and back of each flipper. We carve out the lines with a modeling tool. Then we do the same to the other flipper, but mirrored. Once it's dry, we can sand it with the rotary tool, tapering the foam down towards the ends of the flipper. The underside of the flipper gets to be as detailed as the top because I think it deserves it. And of course it's nowhere near perfect, so we do the sculpting and sanding cycle here until we're happy with it. And while you look at that happening, my light broke right before I filmed this. I have a ceiling light and then a ring light off the side of my desk. It was the ceiling light and it broke in such a strange way. It's one of those color changing bulbs and only the cool white setting was broken. So every color and the regular yellow lighting worked, but the cool white was flickering and so dim it barely lit up at all. My partner contacted the company about it and they went, "Yeah, that's weird, never seen that before," and that was it. I've got a new light bulb now, but I filmed this whole project with wretched yellow lighting and not my beloved cool white. I just personally don't like yellow lighting. I feel like it looks unprofessional and I don't need any help on that front. I barely know how to make videos. Okay, that's the flipper footage sculpting sanding cycle, which is not as hard to say as you might think. And that brief period of time where the tail and tongue were finished, but the flippers were still in the sculpting sanding cycle, don't even worry about it, I was working on the body again. Specifically, the next thing we do is glue in the upper beak with contact cement. It's really important to get the angles right here, because you have to put your fingers in there to press his tongue button, so we need to have finger room. The area where his lower beak is gonna go has really uneven plastic. So, before we can proceed, we need to fill it with foam clay and wait for it to dry. In the meantime, we're gonna start building up his head with EVA foam to save on foam clay. We glue a few triangles of EVA foam together and then onto his head. Now we can start shaping the upper beak with foam clay. At this point, we need to start thinking about the eye placement. The eyes are ping pong balls and they're very much built into the head because of the bases. I hesitate to call those eyelids, but they're fleshy and we'll make them later. Continuing with the foam clay, we add some to the back of his head. You'll notice that his head sensor is unfortunately not going to be usable because it'll be under the clay. We're covering it because I think it's more important that his head shape is uninterrupted. I did a test to see if the penguala would malfunction at all while the head sensor was continually pressed, but he did not seem to notice. Just in case, I wanted the head to have an air pocket directly over the sensor. So we build a bridge between the front and back of his head, just on one side for now. Then we can add some more clay around his eye and down his side. We smooth out the clay with water to give us a better starting point for future sculpting endeavors. Now we add clay to his other eye and side. We're really trying to get the eyes in the right spot because he's already such a silly little guy and it's important that the shapes are right. He's a bit wonky, but not that wonky. Once that's completely dry, we can sand him down and make the other side of his head. We also patch up anything that the rotary tool removed. And with the exception of his inner mouth, we cover everything else with foam clay and smooth it out with water. If you haven't noticed, I'm using these sections where I have so much footage but very little to say about it to just say stuff. And my thing for this section is that earlier today, I got my own PO box, which is super exciting for me because that's real YouTuber stuff. I've had a couple of people ask about sending me animatronics, and now I guess if you wanted to, you can. Or if you wanted to send me a letter, you could, and then I could cherish it forever. You absolutely don't have to, but if you want to send me something silly in the mail, I would love to see that. How cool. Maybe we could even do a thing where if I get a few letters or packages every so often, I could open them on camera and post it here. Sorry, this is very exciting for me. Someone asked about sending me their old Tickle Me Elmo the other day, and with getting a PO box, I'm now a real horror boy. I'll post the PO box details again at the end, but just know that I'm yelling excitedly. We bulk up the back section of the eye socket so that his eyes will sit forward because we're going to be making his eyelids pretty soon. Small Fry has these ridges along his back. I can see 3 of them, and we're going to carve them into him with the rotary tool. Silver Sharpie is really good for drawing on dark foam with, but mine's out of ink. So I just freehanded it, which is an absolutely bonkers thing to do. If I slipped, I could just patch it up, but what a risk. I was crazy back then. The top ridge goes right into his eyelid, the middle to his wing, and the bottom one is basically where his pants are gonna be. We sand it just to get the shapes down, and then of course make it look nice with our foam clay. I know that looks completely horrible, but just bear with me. At the same time, we're also gonna get started on those eyelids. We roll some foam clay into a noodle and attach it to his head before flattening it out a bit. Then we do the same with the other side, pulling the clay up his eye. The eyelids have to perfectly house the ping pong balls, so it's best to do this while they're in place. We wait for all that to dry and then we can sand it down. I've used it a few times already during this project, but we've now swapped from the rotary tool to the sanding stick. The sanding stick gives you better control when you're trying to take off a really tiny amount of foam. While sculpting again, we add a layer of foam to the back of the mouth. Now we continue building up the eyelids. Small Fry has the unique ability to have the most prominent eyelids I've seen in my life. I kept thinking that I'd made them way too big, only to check the reference image and find they were actually a third of the size they're meant to be. I don't know him like the Splatoon fans know him, I'm sorry. Now it's time to give him some nostrils. They're pretty small and shallow, but they are there, so we drill them out with the rotary tool. I then put a small amount of foam clay in that area and sculpted out the nostrils. I've spent so much of the video talking about whatever, but I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you all so much for 50,000 subscribers. That's a huge milestone for me, and I can't believe that there are that many people that are interested in what I do. Thank you so much. I hope you know that I appreciate each and every one of you and that I love reading your comments. It truly does mean the world to me, and I'm really excited for all of our future projects together. Thank you so much. But this eyelid torso situation took a really long time. I tried yapping more in my Withered Bonnie video and I got mostly positive feedback on that. But I don't really have any Splatoon things to say, except that Small Fry is neither a kid nor a squid. Did you know that I have 3 copies of Silent Hill 4? I'm hoping that they'll remake the first one, and then 3 and 4 if the remake of the second game goes well. They don't need remaking, they're perfect, I just want to play them again. Sorry, he just looks so ridiculous with his eyelids like that, they're the same size as him. Absolutely no hate on the design, he will look fine once he's done. He's perfect, but incredibly silly. And with that, we're far enough through sculpting his body that we can add his lower jaw. We mark out where it's gonna go and remove the foam clay from that area with the rotary tool. Now we attach it with contact cement. To save on foam clay, we glue a piece of EVA foam to the underside of his jaw. Then we sculpt his jaw with our foam clay, blending it into his body. Once it's dry, we can sand it down. And of course it was at this point, so late in the game, that I realized that I didn't like the eye placement. They were set too far apart, and we can't have that. To fix it, we start by making an incision to separate the inner eyelid from the body. Then we remove some of the foam under it, closer to the center of his head. We put the eyes in and use a heat gun to heat form the foam while pressing them closer together. The heat forming helps, but it's not quite staying like that naturally. We reattach the eyelid incisions with our Tarzan script glue and heat form them again for good measure. It probably doesn't look like much, and it's only like a centimeter, but the difference there is astronomical. Now we do our final touch-ups to his body sculpt. I have to keep catching myself to stop from calling it his torso instead of his body. I've made one bipedal FNAF character too many. I'm not as used to making critters. Little guys with no discernible legs. Like Small Fry's torso is all of him, minus his hair and flippers. I was really focused here on getting the body as smooth as possible and getting the eyelids to be even in both angle and height. And once we're happy with it, it's finally time to attach his flippers. The first thing we have to do is remove the clay from where the plastic piece will sit. Then we can glue them on with contact cement, making sure they match. Of course, we can't leave it with the plastic exposed, so we cover it in foam clay and blend it into the flipper. The hinge is going to be visible, but I promise that it won't stay hot pink. We can't cover it or the flippers won't move, but it'll get painted to look like the rest of him. When it's dry, we can sand it down, add more clay, and repeat until we're happy with it. There he is, he's really coming together. And while we were waiting for all of that to dry, I was painting the eyes. We cut a hole into each eye so they can sit on a skewer and then put down a pale yellow base coat, which made me a bit nervous. Because of course, while I was painting the eyes, I was also making his hair. And I think it's truly incredible that I didn't get any hair fibers in the paint when some of them ended up on the other side of the house. We'll get to the hair soon, we're kind of almost approaching the home stretch, I think. Anyway, we paint a bright red for his irises. I'll be the first to admit that painting isn't my strong suit. My hands are shaky, my vision isn't fantastic, and color theory is completely lost on me. So, if some of these shots look particularly zoomed in or odd, it's because I'm hunched over trying to get my face as close as possible to what I'm doing. Don't worry about it, I think they turned out fine. We mix up a darker red to do a ring around his irises and paint it on with my tiniest paintbrush. We also add a slightly lighter red to the iris to detail it. If I have one painting tip to impart, it's to have small Q-tips on hand. Acrylic paint is water-based, so you can wet a Q-tip and gently remove any mistakes you make with it before the paint dries. For the pupils, I used a Posca paint pen and drew them straight on. I find a paint pen steadier to use than a brush, and it's straight black, so no need to worry about the shade. It would be so awesome, it would be so cool to not mess up the paint at the last possible moment and get black paint everywhere. We're gonna take them outside and gloss coat them so they're a bit shiny, and also sealed to protect them. But let's take a look at his beautiful hair. So I need to preface this bit by saying that I was originally planning to mix 2 colors of yarn for his hair, which is why we've got 2 skeins here. But I really didn't like how the colors looked together, so we didn't go for that. See that lighter yarn there? Don't look at that, ignore it. Bright red yarn only. What we're gonna do here is make the yarn into his hair. I started by wrapping the yarn around my hand a few times, cutting it and tying a knot in the middle. And I don't think it matters how many of these pieces we make because it's not going to be enough and we will have to make more later regardless. Then we brush the yarn out with a dog brush, starting from the ends and working our way towards the center. When we have a small pile of fluffed up yarn, it's time to break out the hair straightener. Using the lowest heat setting, we straighten the hair. I brushed each section before doing a final pass with the straightener just to make sure it was cooperating. That's not going to be nearly enough hair, but it's enough to get us started. Little Buddy can have a variety of hairstyles. So, if you're using this as a tutorial, you can do any hairstyle you like. But the recipient of this commission has their in-game small fry rocking what I think is the best hairstyle. And that's what we're gonna give this one. The Humble Spiked Mohawk, or Liberty Spikes. We're gonna make the base of them from craft foam. Ideally we'd use a foam that matches the color of the hair, but I didn't have any red foam, so black it is. That really just helps if any of the foam will peek through the hair, but that's not gonna be a problem for us because they're gonna be so covered. We patterned them and cut them out of craft foam. They're all the same basic shape, but each spike was patterned individually. There's a finite amount of space on Small Fry's head, and if any one of these was too big, I'd have to redo it. A real measure twice, cut once situation because the hair as a whole took so long. We heat form our spikes into shape and then glue the edges together with contact cement. I wanted these to be really strong and secure, so we cut a strip of craft foam for each spike, and that gets glued to the inside along the seam for added support. Now we sand down the seam to get rid of any bumps and cut off the excess in a tab. And it's time to glue his hair on. I cannot tell you how many episodes of Star Trek I got through while doing this. This process takes a long time, but I think it's worth it. We cut the knot away from the hair and spread a thin layer of glue over just one section of a spike. Then we lay the hair over it, making sure that the hair is all pointing in the same direction. We move around the spike, repeating this process. The end gets cut into a point and styled with a tiny dab of our Tarzan's grip glue. Then each layer of hair gets sealed with a coat of PVA glue. This holds any loose fibers in place and will make it nice and solid. I lost count of how many layers I did, maybe around 5. When I say that the hair took a long time, I mean both that my hands were covered in glue for ages and that I had to wait overnight for the PVA to dry before laying down more hair. I had a lot of fun doing this bit. I love a good repetitive task with a TV show on in the background. The final layer of hair is the most important because it's the bulk of what you're gonna see. So we need to make sure that each spike comes to a nice point in the final layer. I use this technique for my cosplay of Tricky from Madness Combat. Maybe one day I'll do this with a color that isn't red. Once they're finally done and completely dry, we need to fix those ends. We trim them down and glue the ends into the spike. The hair was so thick that we cut a bunch of the innermost layer away so it'll fit. And that's the hair done for now. It's not completely finished, but we'll come back to it. We seal him to get him ready for painting with 4 to 5 coats of Mod Podge mixed with water. Then we wrap his lower body in electrical tape to protect him, and also because I ran out of masking tape. Now we can paint him. We take him outside and do a coat of grey primer and then a coat of silver. And that's mostly so we can shoot it into his flipper holes and get any bright pink plastic to a nice silver, but also to achieve an even starting point that isn't super dark. I had a little bit of trouble with painting him because I just couldn't get him looking how I wanted. Of course you get to see that all, but I'll run you through it quickly. I used a pearl white paint for the white accents on his body, which had a nice effect but wasn't quite right. Then I blocked out the white sections with a more opaque, non-pearlescent white paint, including the ridges on his back and a gradient on his flippers and tail, and went back in with the pearlescent paint. The areas were too rigidly blocked out, so I used silver paint to blend them together a bit. But he still didn't look right because he was too metallic. Like if they ever made a skin in the game where he was a robot, this is what it'd look like. Unsurprising that a guy known for making possessed animatronics made a flesh creature too robotic looking. So, we cover the silver with grey paint, and lightly apply some pearl white along where the white and grey meet to make him look less robotic. Now we take a sponge and lightly dapple on some silver to make him look more like a biological life form. And that adds a little bit of shine without him being straight up silver. With the main color and the white on, we can add the darker grey. It gets lightly brushed and blended into the top of his upper beak and the ridges in his flippers and tail. To add some color, we paint his inner mouth a nice red. We use a tiny amount of silver paint to highlight his nostrils and deepen the insides with our darker grey. His tongue gets painted pink, and we have to be careful here not to seal his tongue button together with paint. The landlord special, but with salmonid tongue. We take him outside to seal him, and with that, he's painted. We're so close to done. He's really coming together. The next thing we're gonna do is make him his pants, dress, sock thing. We pattern it by wrapping him in Glad Wrap and covering that in duct tape. We draw straight onto it, marking any seams and the top and bottom edges. Now we cut it out, and that's our pattern. Small Fry's outfit is this lovely green color with ribbing, and I was struggling to find a fabric that I liked for it. I don't know why I have such a hard time finding green fabric specifically, but this has been a long-term problem in my life. Kmart once again came to save me because I was walking through and spotted this tank top in their clearance section. We cut the side and shoulder seams, fold the fabric in half, and pin our pattern to it. Now we cut it out, adding seam allowance. I grabbed a size 20 because it was either that or a size 8, and I wanted to make sure that it was wide enough for our pattern. There were a bunch of these in a size 20. I'm not aiming to take cheap clothes from someone who needs them. I thought that I might need to cut this out more than once, which is why I fully cut the seams. But it was right the first try, so I could have left the shirt intact and made it into a crop top. My bad, it lives in my fabric stash now. Maybe for our next project we can craft me some self-esteem. We pin it to his body and trim it to fit better. Now we machine sew up our 2 center back seams. We put it back on him and pin it down again. He has top stitching visible on the upper seam, which we're gonna do with embroidery floss. That's just a running stitch, and it actually helps cinch his pants in around his waist, if you can call it that. This is gonna be my final yap session of the video, because I wanted to tell you that I've been thinking about doing clay modeling videos. They'd probably be non-speaking, so just some background music and sped up footage of me making little guys out of foam clay. Voicing and editing my videos takes a huge amount of time, and this would skip almost all of that, so I could intersperse them between my bigger projects. Is that something you'd be potentially interested in watching? I think it'd be fun, and then I get to make a little guy from a thing I like. Let me know what you think. I'd really appreciate any feedback. Finally, we can glue it on. We start with the top edge before flipping him upside down and doing the bottom. And now you can finally see why I picked this particular Hatchimal. I have a few of these guys, but this one has a green underside while my others are blue and pink. I know from experience that if I paint the underside, it's gonna chip off in places when the animatronic moves and the base hits the ground. I used the green one because even though it's not the right shade of green, at least it's not a completely different color. Also, we glue down his tail hole. But while all of that was happening, there's one final silly piece that we haven't touched yet. His single Billy Bob-esque tooth. We cut it out of high-density EVA foam, making sure that the bottom is angled. Then we round the edges with our rotary tool and heat seal it with our heat gun. I love that the bear animatronics from Gravity Falls and Rise of the TMNT also have this tooth thing going on, but it makes me think of Billy Bob of the Rockafire Explosion, and I love him, so I think it's a very endearing trait. Even if it made me think about birds or fish having human teeth. We seal it with 4 to 5 coats of Mod Podge, paint it white, and gloss coat it outside. Robot Small Fry in the background there shows exactly when I was doing this. But we're putting his tooth aside for now because I am sick and tired of him being bald. His hair spikes are currently hollow, which we need to fix. We cut some foam circles to go inside each spike, so we've got more surface area for the glue to stick to. We cut them out pretty roughly and glue them in with contact cement. Now we have to figure out the exact placement for each of them. This has to be exact, because if they're too spaced out, that bottom one is going to be almost touching his tail. It might not look like it, but each spike has a particular order that it goes in and a right way up. And that was marked on the inside but ended up covered by the hair. So the first thing we have to do is figure out approximate placement and remark which way each spike goes, because the base of each spike conforms to the shape of his head. Now we can get started with attaching them. We remove the paint that's definitely going to be covered by the spike with the rotary tool and glue the top spike on with contact cement. Then we work our way down the back of his head, doing one spike at a time. This was absolutely nerve-wracking. One spike out of place or a slip of the rotary tool could be so bad. Just in case anyone had any concerns, those spikes are very sturdy. You can pick them up by a single spike with no problem. You shouldn't, because that's not the correct way to hold your small fry, but you can. What if I told you that it was also time to glue in his eyes? We sand down his eye sockets because I just know that paint got in there, and then sand down the back third of his eyes. The commissioner wanted his eyes to be pointed in slightly different directions, so what qualifies as the back of the eye is different for both of them. Then we put down our contact cement and glue his eyes in. Also using contact cement, we're going to attach his single tooth. As the final step, we're going to tidy up some stray hairs. Apparently the only small scissors I have are part of a Swiss Army knife, but it works. I'll show you what he looks like properly in just a moment, and you can see him waddle around. I really wanted to make my little Amnesia Fluttershy next, but I have a house inspection coming up, and I fear they may not renew our lease if I have a meter-tall skinned robot horse taking up my entire desk. So perhaps we can do a cheeky little house inspection appropriate, non-animatronic project just for the meantime. I need to become Toby Normal Boy. We'll have to see. I wanted to have that project done for Halloween, which might not be possible, but let's see how we go. So many plans, so little time. Also, do you guys like Small Fry? What hairstyle does yours have in game if you play? Okay, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.